Welcome to Inside View. I'm your host, Joel Metzger, and joining me today is Congressman Tom McClintock, who represents California's 4th District. Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks for having me back.
Nice to see you. You've come through here several times over the last year or so, and I know the community really appreciates hearing from you.
Well, that's the best source of information I have.
So you've been kind of making a trip through the foothills. Tell the viewers, how often do you make it out to California, and how often are you back east?
Well, I come back to California every weekend, I do town hall forums all across the district. We did our 50th town hall forum in Oakhurst this week, and the 51st one in Mariposa. So I try to get out here, whenever the Congress is not actually in session.
You are a very busy man, and you have lots of issues that you're concerned with, and we're going to go through those over the next half an hour. But before we do, I wanted any viewer who hasn't been introduced to you to just get a brief summary of where you grew up and then your political career. Well,
they can get that at my website at mcclintock.house.gov. But essentially, I've been an advocate for fiscal restraint, constitutionally limited government, individual liberty, and personal responsibility is the hallmark of our public policy. I think the closer we hew to those principles, the better our nation does. The farther we drift from those principles, the worse our nation does.
How many years have you been an elected official?
Well, I was in the California legislature for 22 years. That's when I came to some prominence, sounding warnings of the unsustainable rate of state spending. I ran in the recall election against Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2003 on that specific platform. And I'm now trying to sound the same warnings in Washington.
Do you think that at some point you would potentially want to run for governor again?
Not in the foreseeable future, no. I been there, done that, and got the T-shirt, as they say.
Okay. The position that you hold now, is it something that you really have enjoyed?
Oh, very much, very much. It's sobering to realize that the decisions that we're making right now as a people and that are being reflected in Washington are decisions that are going to be traveling with our country for many, many decades, perhaps even many generations to come. And when we run up $1 trillion deficit, as we did last year, that's $9,000 taken out of the future earnings of every family in America. You cannot pursue these policies very long without having a devastating impact on the future. So it's a very sobering experience.
You mentioned sobering. How do you stay optimistic as a politician in these times?
Well, I believe that our nation is founded on some very sound principles. One of them is that when people are paying close attention to public policy, they begin to make very good decisions, and ultimately they will set things right. I see lots of signs of that beginning to stir around the country now. We saw a big dose of it in 2010. 2012 was a disappointment, a setback, but that happens along the way. I think that over the next 4 years, the American people are about to get a graduate level course in Obamonomics, and I think at the end of that course, they are going to be a lot sadder and a lot wiser and ready to return to those uniquely American principles that produced the most prosperous and happy republic in the history of the world.
You have a certain way of thinking, and a lot of people like you have a certain way of thinking, and then there's a very different way of looking at the world. Where does that other mentality come from, and why is it at times actually more popular than the way you look at the world?
Well, because it's superficially very attractive until you start to think it through. I mean, our country's now in the 5th year of policies based on the assumption that if government can just spend enough money, it will jumpstart consumer spending and revive the economy. We have squandered trillions upon trillions of dollars of the nation's wealth in pursuit of these policies, and all that we have to show for it is chronically high unemployment. You saw the numbers that came out today. Another 660,000 Americans simply gave up looking for work. There are more than 90 million Americans now who are simply not working. These policies have not worked because they cannot work. Government cannot cannot inject a dollar into the economy that is not first taken out of the very same economy. It's true, if I take a dollar from Peter and give it to Paul, Paul's going to have an extra dollar to spend. He's going to take that into a local shop and spend that dollar, and the dollar's going to ripple through the economy. That's all true. But Peter now has one less dollar to spend in that very same economy, one less dollar to ripple through. And that's why these income transfers will always net to zero economic growth on paper. And in practice, they can often do enormous harm because you're transferring huge amounts of capital from investments that would have been made by the productive sector based upon the highest return for that value. And you're transferring those decisions to the government sector, which makes its investments based on the highest political return of that dollar. That is the difference between Apple and Solyndra. And that's the basic problem that we're facing. We can see the job that is created when government puts that dollar back into the economy. What we don't see as clearly are the jobs that are destroyed or prevented from forming as government first takes that dollar out of the economy. We see those lost jobs in a chronically high unemployment rate and a stagnating economy, and that has been the story of the last 5 years.
Let's talk jobs for a second. You mentioned a report that just came out today.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting about the report is it actually looked as though unemployment went down. So why is that when in fact we didn't create...
88,000 jobs were created. 660,000 people simply gave up looking for work. Because the labor pool has shrunk by 660,000, that meager job creation actually looks good because we only classify somebody unemployed if they don't have a job and are actually looking for work. When 660,000 people simply throw up their hands and leave the workforce, they're no longer counted in those numbers. The fact is that if the labor participation rate, the percentage of people actually working in the economy, were the same today as it was on Inauguration Day of 2009, these unemployment numbers would actually be over 11%. And then you have to factor in all of the folks that are struggling with just part-time hours here and there rather than full-time jobs. They're counted as employed in those unemployment numbers. If you take them into account, the actual unemployment rate's now over 14%, and that's going to be getting a lot worse as small businesses all across the country call in their employees and say, look, we are having huge new costs imposed by Obamacare. We can't sustain those costs. We'll have to either close or we'll have to cut all of you back to 29 hours a week, which keeps you in under the Obama threshold. There's even a word for these employees today, 29ers, people who would be working 40 hours a week, but they're small businesses because of the Obamacare mandate have had to cut them back to 29 hours.
So this is going to have a very real impact on a lot of small businesses.
Huge impact. Bad policy is what is producing these results. The good news is we also know how to revive an economy. We've done it many times before. When people say this is the worst economy since the Depression, I remember a time not all that long ago when we had not only double-digit unemployment, we had double-digit inflation, mile-long lines around gas stations, interest rates at 21.5%. Maybe we don't remember those days as vividly. It's because they didn't last very long. That was the end of the Carter administration. Ronald Reagan came in, diagnosed the problem very differently than this administration. You remember his inauguration. He said, in this great economic crisis, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. He cut back the taxes and the regulations that were crushing the economy, and the result was one of the most prolonged periods of economic expansion in our nation's history. That's not just, and by the way, Calvin Coolidge did the same thing in the mid-1920s, but this is not a uniquely Republican policy. John F. Kennedy did the same thing in the mid-19s or in the early 1960s with the same result. Harry S. Truman in 1946 cut the federal budget from $85 billion down to $30 billion in a single year. He fired 10 million federal employees. It was called war demobilization. The Keynesians at the time predicted 25% unemployment in a second Great Depression. Instead, we had the post-war economic boom. We know how to create jobs. Government cannot create jobs because government cannot create wealth. It can transfer jobs from the productive sector to the government sector by taxing one and spending on the other. It can transfer jobs within the productive sector by taxing one and subsidizing a politically favored company like Solyndra. It can do that very well. It cannot create jobs. Jobs are created by the freedom of commerce, and that requires the lowest possible burden of regulation and taxation and litigation.
In Calaveras County, we at one point had an unemployment rate of more than 14%, and now we're down to about 11%. So we are seeing some better times. However, that's still double-digit unemployment. What are some things?
And by the way, we should remember that is normal economic growth should be in the 3 or 4% a year range. We're seeing it in the 1% range and saying, "Oh, what a relief."
My point is, it's still pretty bad, and I know a lot of people are searching for some way to get better and some hope. What would you say people should look for in this area, and maybe what could be done to increase the number of jobs here?
Well, the fact that in one of the most resource-rich areas of the world, we have to ask such questions tells us the extent of the damage that these policies have done. This region used to prosper from a thriving timber industry. An old forester told me that all of that excess timber is going to come out of the forest one way or another. It'll either be carried out or it will be burned out, but it will come out. When we carried it out, we had not only much healthier forests, but we also had a thriving economy. In the past 30 years, when these forests have been consigned to benign neglect, of what we've seen are vastly more frequent and ferocious forest fires, and an economy laid prostrate at the foot of all of these regulations. Freedom works, and it is time that we put it back to work.
Congressman, we also have a thriving tourism industry in this particular county and in neighboring counties. And I know that's a big part of how some people are surviving despite not being able to use the natural resources. There's an issue that came up recently a little south of here in Yosemite having to do with tourism. And I know that you have actually gone down there and had some discussions. So fill in Calaveras County residents on what's happening.
Well, what the Park Service is proposing to do is to tear out hundreds of parking places that are currently there, tear out hundreds of riverside campsites that are currently there, stop the bicycle rentals, the river rafting rentals, the equestrian rides. They want to tear out the historic ice skating rink at Curry Village. It's been there since the 1920s. They want to tear out the historic Sugar Pine Stone Bridge that's on the National Historic Registry. They want to tear out swimming pools. And by the way, to add insult to insanity, this all comes with a price tag to taxpayers of about $250 million. So the taxpayers not only lose all of these amenities, they also have to pay through the nose for the privilege of losing them. This is part of a radical and retrograde ideology that we've been touching on already in this discussion. We're seeing it with the Forest Service, we're seeing it with the Park Service, and it's essentially this bizarre notion that somehow people are a bane and a pestilence on Mother Gaia, and we've got to force them off the public lands and get them to concentrate in dense urban cores, leave the rest of the planet alone to Mother Earth. Roughly stated, they want to put our public lands back into their pristine prehistoric condition, even if it requires throwing off the public from the public's lands. And we have to understand that fundamentally changes the entire purpose of Yosemite, which was established by an act signed by Abraham Lincoln in June of 1864 for the express purpose of public recreation and resort activities in perpetuity.
And many people across the world think that the national park idea was one of the best that America has ever come up with.
Yes, but it's being fundamentally changed. This is what we have to understand. The whole notion of the national forests and the public parks were to preserve large portions of land for the public's enjoyment in perpetuity. Now that philosophy is being turned 180 degrees, and the idea now is to push the public off the public's lands. We're seeing this in the Forest Service with family cabins that have been there for generations being pushed out by exorbitant rates. We're seeing access, and many of the roads that gave people access to the forests being closed. We're seeing restrictions on camping, on hunting, on all the things that make it possible for people to enjoy their public lands. We're getting very much back into a situation that we saw in Normanton Plantagenet, England, when the royal crown closed 1/3 of the land area of southern England to access by the general population. It was supposed to be the exclusive preserve of the crown and the crown's friends. This became so outrageous to the English people that no fewer than 5 clauses in the Magna Carta were devoted to redressing this grievance. And now we're watching that same human a tendency to want to dominate and exclude whatever's under our jurisdiction. We're now seeing that being practiced by our own government. The difference is Normanton Plantagenet, England, was governed by tyrants. This is supposed to be a free nation, a democratically governed nation. The land belongs to the public. The public has every right to enjoy it.
You have dealt with a lot of natural resources throughout your career as a politician, and right now you sit on the Water and Power Subcommittee, is that correct?
Actually, I chair the Water and Power Subcommittee, and then I also sit on the Public Lands Committee of Natural Resources. And I fought hard for those positions because they are so critical to the economy of this entire region.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what we're all about here. Going over to the water and power, you've mentioned the need to stockpile water, the need to create hydropower as one of the things that wouldn't be nuclear, wouldn't be coal, wouldn't be wind, other things. It's a great way to use our natural resources in your mind. I'm wondering, are there any ways that you're working to create more of a water reserve in this particular region, especially as we see more and more drought years?
Well, in this region, of course, we have McClure Lake and the Merced Irrigation District's proposal to increase the spillway elevation by about 10 feet. That would allow the capture of about 70,000 acre-feet of additional water that we simply lose during high runoffs. That's enough to support about 800 agricultural jobs, or conversely to meet the residential needs of about 70,000 households, and generate enough electricity for about 1,700 households, and that's the cleanest and cheapest electricity on the planet. That requires a boundary adjustment. The Lake McClure was established with a Federal Energy and Regulatory Commission boundary to support the hydroelectric potential of the dam. Unfortunately, in 1992, a wild and scenic river designation was given to 71 miles of the Merced River that actually overlapped about 1,800 feet with the pre-existing FERC boundary. So at their request, I'm sponsoring legislation to readjust the boundaries, which would then accommodate the additional water storage and electricity generation at the New Exchequer Dam. And then, of course, we have a much bigger potential in the north side of the district with the Auburn Dam, which was actually partially constructed. In fact, all of the most expensive construction elements had already been completed, cutting the foundations out of the solid granite walls, cutting the diversion tunnels. That's the most expensive part of dam building. That was all completed when Jerry Brown canceled the program and we walked away from it in mid-construction.
When was that?
That was in the mid-1970s. This would provide 2.3 million acre-feet of water storage. That's enough water for about 2.3 million average households, and about 800 megawatts of the cleanest and cheapest electricity on the planet. That's enough for almost 1 million households.
What would it be a similar sized reservoir that is in existence to what the Auburn Dam would produce?
Shasta, I think, would be a bit bigger. New Melones a bit smaller.
So it's a pretty big reservoir.
Yeah, it would be a big reservoir, but we need it. We haven't added a major new facility to the system since 1979 with the New Melones. Meanwhile, the population has grown dramatically.
Why did the Auburn Dam not get built?
It was part of Jerry Brown's small is beautiful, New Age mantra that if we stopped building things, people would stop coming. So we stopped building dams and aqueducts. We stopped building highways. We stopped other people from building homes. We stopped building electricity generating capacity. People came anyway, and now we're dealing with a chronic shortage in all of those areas.
I had heard there was a possible earthquake fault concern. Is there anything to that?
Not really. The Oroville Oroville suffered a earthquake in the mid-1970s. There was speculation at the time that this might have been a gravity-induced earthquake. In other words, because of the weight of the water, it may have caused the underlying faults to shift a little bit. That's since been debunked, but in the meantime, the Auburn Dam was completely redesigned to withstand an earthquake 8 times that force.
Oh, okay. So they did mitigate that in the plans.
Yeah.
Okay. Does the area need?
And by the way, that the fault that they're referring to hasn't shifted in well over 1 million years.
Okay.
Meanwhile, among other benefits, the Auburn Dam would provide 400-year flood control protection for the Sacramento Valley.
Does the area need that water reserve? Is there a shortage right now?
Well, there's a shortage system-wide, and it's getting worse. We saw that in the Central Valley when hundreds of billions of gallons of water were diverted into the Pacific Ocean for the amusement of the Delta smelt. That caused, I believe the figure was 250,000 acres of the most productive and fertile farmland in the country to go dry. It cost thousands and thousands of jobs, has an enduring impact on the price that all of us pay at the grocery stores. We need more water. We need more electricity. As the water and electricity supplies continue to be stretched by an ever-growing population, the prices have been skyrocketing. I mean, we've seen that on our water bills. We've seen that on our electricity bills. When something is plentiful, it is cheap. When it is scarce, it is expensive. Water and electricity are becoming much more scarce because of these policies, and therefore they're becoming much more expensive. More water and more electricity is better than less water and less electricity. I think we can all agree on that.
There's a study, I think, that's supposed to take place of flood control in the Natomas area and maybe levee repair. Are you leveraging that study with the Auburn Dam in some way?
Again, the levees for Natomas are about 200-year flood protection for the Sacramento Plain. It's all part of the same system. The Auburn Dam is 400 years of flood protection, and yes, I think before any federal money is spent on the 200-year levee construction, we also at least ought to insist that the State Water Control Board restore to the federal government the right to proceed with the Auburn Dam.
Gotcha.
Which, by the way, was withdrawn last year and is now the most immediate stumbling block toward resuming that project.
The Delta is a huge issue, and water from these counties go down into the Delta, and I know that there's a big Delta plan. Are you in support of the direction the state's moving with the Delta? Or do you...
No. Again, the whole focus of the state plan is to divert increasing amounts of water to dump into the Pacific Ocean for the, as I said, for the care and amusement of the Delta smelt, which is about a 3-inch minnow. They're putting the smelt ahead of the people who desperately need that water. And the point that I've been making is, look, we do not spend billions of dollars for dams and reservoirs and aqueducts and all the other system-wide measures just to dump that water into the Pacific Ocean. Fact of the matter is that water tends to run downhill. If you leave it alone, it will run off to the Pacific Ocean very, very well on its own. We build these systems to stop it from running into the Pacific Ocean so that in dry years we've got plenty of water, and we protect the environment from the environmentally devastating cycle of droughts and floods that it had suffered for millennia before the intervention of man.
In the last few minutes that we have, I wanted to make sure we touched on the sequester since it's an ongoing thing. Could you explain to our viewers what that is and what the fallout will be?
It's a restraint on government spending, and a minor one at that. It's less than 1/3 of what Standard & Poor's warned was the minimum deficit reduction necessary to preserve our nation's AAA credit rating. To understand, and put it in perspective, you need to know three numbers: 39, 37, and 64. Once you know those three numbers, you're a budget expert. 39% is the increase of inflation and population in this country over the last 10 years. 37% is the increase in revenues in the same period. That's despite the Bush tax cuts, despite the recession, and that's before the massive tax increases that the economy was whacked with in January. Our revenues were keeping up very, very well with our inflation and population growth. The problem is that third number: 64% is the increase in spending in the same period. The sequester actually does not cut spending in a conventional sense of the word. We end up spending more money this year than we did last year, but the rate of growth will be slowed to about 1/2%. Measured against the totality of federal spending, it's about a 2.5% reduction. That's after a decade in which the budget's grown 64%. I think most families, most businesses struggling through these past 5 years have had to make far, far sterner reductions in their budget than the sequester calls for. And yet we're told it's going to be the end of Western civilization. And the good news is I think that the president has shown his hand in dealing with the sequester. We've seen the memos from his administration out to various agencies essentially saying we really want these cuts under the sequester to be visible and we want them to hurt. And that was personified by the president's decision to close the White House to school groups. They've spent the year saving up to come to Washington for their big school adventure in their nation's capital. It closes the White House because of the sequester, he says. That saves $18,000 a week. Now, put that in perspective. The operating Air Force One costs about $180,000 an hour. So, Joel, if you were president and you had a choice over managing these budget reductions, what would you choose? Closing the People's House to the people to save $18,000, or running Air Force One an average of 6 minutes less every week? Well, we know the choice the president made. I think we all know the choice that each of us would make, and there's a big difference, and that's something that I think is causing now people to take a second look at this administration and begin to realize what's involved.
Congressman, in the last minute that we have, if people wanted to find out more about you or contact you, where would they go? McClintock.house.gov. That's my website. I've got all of my votes on it, all of the reasons for the votes, all of the speeches that I've given. The voice and vote that I have in Washington is merely on loan to me from the people of this district, and I try to be as accountable as I can to explain to them how I'm voting, why I'm voting that way. Even if you don't agree with it, at least you'll see why I was voting that way, and the speeches that I've given really on behalf of the people of this district. Congressman, thank you. My pleasure, Joel. Thank you. And thank you for joining me on this edition of Inside View. I'm your host, Joel Metzger, and I hope to see you right here next time.